The moment I saw my daughter lower her eyes and step aside like a servant in the house I had bought for her, I knew someone had stolen far more than a property while I was gone. My name is Helen Carter, and for 15 years I lived and worked in Vancouver, Canada. 15 years of early mornings, double shifts, missed holidays, and video calls squeezed between work schedules. Every extra dollar I earned had a purpose. I wasn't building a retirement fund or collecting luxury possessions. I was building a future for my children back home in Texas. Most of all, I was building security for my daughter, Emily. When her father passed away, she was only 20 years old. Sensitive, kind-hearted, and far too trusting for a world that often rewarded the opposite. Before leaving for Canada, I bought a beautiful 4-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood outside Dallas. It wasn't a mansion, but it was solid, comfortable, and fully paid for. I remember handing Emily the keys. She cried. I cried. We stood on the front porch holding each other while the Texas sun dipped behind the trees. No matter what happens, I told her, you'll always have a home. For 15 years, I believed she did. The flight back to Texas felt longer than any flight I had ever taken. Not because of the distance, but because of the anticipation. I imagined family dinners, laughter, grandchildren running through the yard, and Emily greeting me at the front door with the same bright smile she had when she was young. During the flight, I looked through old photographs on my phone. Birthdays I had missed. Christmas mornings viewed through video screens. Graduation pictures sent through text messages. I told myself every sacrifice had been worth it. As the plane descended, I pressed my forehead against the window and watched the familiar landscape appear beneath the clouds. Home. The word alone made my chest tighten. A few hours later, my taxi turned onto the street where the house stood. At first glance, everything looked perfect. The lawn was trimmed. The flower beds were neat. Fresh paint covered the exterior. The place looked even better than I remembered. Yet something felt wrong immediately. I couldn't explain it. Sometimes a house speaks before anyone inside says a word. This house felt silent in a way that unsettled me. I stepped out of the taxi and rolled my suitcase toward the front porch. My heart raced. I imagined Emily hearing the doorbell and running outside. Instead, after a long pause, the front door opened slowly. A woman I didn't recognize stood there. She was elegantly dressed and looked surprised to see me. Not pleasantly surprised. More like someone caught off guard. "Can I help you?" she asked. I smiled politely. "I'm Helen Carter. I'm Emily's mother." The woman hesitated. Just for a second. But I noticed. Then she stepped aside. "Come in." The living room looked beautiful, yet strangely unfamiliar. Family photographs I expected to see were missing. Furniture had been rearranged. Decorations reflected someone else's taste. I was still taking everything in when I heard footsteps coming from deeper inside the house. I turned. A woman appeared carrying a tray with glasses of iced tea. Her clothes were simple. Her shoulders were slightly hunched. She kept her eyes down as she walked. Then she looked up. The tray trembled in her hands. My breath caught. It was Emily. My daughter looked older than 35. Not because of age, but because of exhaustion. There was no excitement in her eyes. No joyful tears. No smile. Just a flash of surprise quickly replaced by something else. Something that looked dangerously close to fear. And in that moment, standing inside the home I had bought for her 15 years earlier, I realized I had returned to a story I did not understand. Emily recovered first. She lowered her gaze again and carefully placed the tray on the coffee table. "Mom," she whispered. The single word carried none of the excitement I had imagined during 15 years away. It sounded cautious, almost rehearsed. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around her before she could say anything else. For a moment she stood still. Then she hugged me back. Her shoulders trembled slightly. When we pulled apart, she forced a small smile that never reached her eyes. "You should have told me you were coming," she said. "I wanted to surprise everyone," I replied. I studied her face. She looked healthy enough at first glance, but the details told a different story. The faint circles beneath her eyes. The tension in her jaw. The way she kept glancing toward the elegantly dressed woman standing across the room. "Emily, are you all right?" I asked. "Of course," she answered too quickly. "Everything is fine." The woman stepped forward with a practiced smile. "I am Vanessa, Richard's wife." I shook her hand. So this was my daughter-in-law. We had spoken only a handful of times over video calls through the years. She seemed pleasant enough then. Standing in front of me now, she appeared confident, polished, and completely comfortable inside this house. More comfortable than Emily. We were not expecting visitors today, Vanessa said. Especially family returning after so long. Her tone was polite, but something underneath it felt cold. Well, I am home now, I said gently. And I hope I am not interrupting anything. Not at all, she replied. We are always happy to welcome family. Emily quietly picked up empty glasses from a side table and carried them toward the kitchen. The movement caught my attention immediately. She was not sitting with us. She was serving us. I watched her disappear through the doorway. A few minutes later, she returned carrying fresh napkins. Then she adjusted decorations on a shelf. Then she disappeared again. The pattern repeated itself so naturally that nobody else seemed to notice. But I noticed. Mothers always do. Richard arrived shortly afterward. The front door opened, and my son walked in with a broad smile. He hugged me warmly and spent several minutes talking about traffic, work, and how wonderful it was to see me again. Yet, even during our conversation, Emily remained in the background. She brought drinks. She cleared dishes. She fetched items people requested without being asked twice. During lunch, the feeling grew stronger. Vanessa sat at the head of the table. Richard sat beside her. I was given the seat across from them. Emily arrived last carrying a bowl of salad. She served everyone before serving herself. By the time she finally sat down, most of the conversation was already underway. I tried to include her. Emily, tell me about your work. She hesitated. Vanessa answered first. Emily helps around here a lot. We honestly do not know what we would do without her. Everyone laughed softly. Everyone except Emily. She lowered her eyes and pushed food around her plate. The knot in my stomach tightened. Later that afternoon, while Richard and Vanessa discussed errands, I wandered through the house alone. Family photographs lined the hallway walls. I stopped in front of one frame after another. Richard, Vanessa, vacation pictures, holiday gatherings, anniversary celebrations. Yet Emily appeared in surprisingly few photographs. When she did appear, she stood near the edges, never at the center, never beside the others. I continued walking until I reached the second floor. The master bedroom door stood open. Inside were expensive furnishings and luxury decorations that clearly belonged to Richard and Vanessa. Across the hall were two guest rooms, both fully furnished. I frowned. Then I looked for Emily's room. When I finally found it, it was not upstairs at all. A narrow door near the back hallway led to a small converted storage room beside the laundry area. Inside stood a twin bed, a small dresser, and a folding chair. I stared silently at the room. Then I noticed a framed photograph on the nightstand. It showed Emily and me standing together on the front porch 15 years earlier, holding the keys to this house, and smiling as if the future could never betray us. I stood in that small room for a long time, staring at the photograph. The frame was old. A thin layer of dust covered the edges. It was not the kind of picture someone displayed proudly in the center of a home. It looked more like a memory hidden away where few people would notice it. I picked it up carefully. Emily looked so young in the picture. Hopeful, confident. The house behind us looked brand new. Back then, I had believed I was giving her stability. Standing there now, I felt a growing uneasiness that I could no longer ignore. I heard footsteps in the hallway and quickly placed the photograph back where I had found it. Emily appeared in the doorway carrying a basket of folded laundry. For a brief moment, surprise crossed her face. Then she forced another smile. I was looking for you, she said softly. I glanced around the room. This is your bedroom? Her eyes dropped immediately. It is fine, Mom. Fine. The answer landed heavily in my chest. I remembered the large bedroom upstairs that overlooked the backyard. That room had always been meant for Emily. I remembered helping her choose paint colors before I left. I remembered mailing money for renovations years later. Yet somehow she now slept beside a washing machine in a room barely large enough for a twin bed. Emily, I said gently, what happened? She adjusted the laundry basket in her arms. Nothing happened. Sweetheart, I am your mother. For a second, I thought she might finally tell me the truth. Her lips parted slightly. Her eyes glistened. Then a voice echoed from downstairs. Emily, it was Vanessa. The change in my daughter was immediate. Her shoulders straightened. The emotion disappeared from her face. I should go help, she said quickly. Then she turned and walked away before I could stop her. That evening I sat on the back patio alone, watching the sun settle behind the trees. The backyard looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I had simply changed over 15 years. Through the kitchen window, I could see movement inside. Vanessa sat comfortably at the island scrolling through her phone. Richard watched television in the adjoining family room. Emily moved between them carrying dishes, wiping counters, and organizing groceries. Nobody appeared to notice how much she was doing. It had become normal. That realization bothered me more than anything. Later, during dinner, I paid closer attention. Small things began to stand out. Vanessa asked Emily to refill her water glass without even looking up. Emily immediately stood and did it. Richard asked where a document was located. Emily knew exactly where to find it. When dinner ended, everyone rose from the table except Emily. She remained behind clearing plates while the others continued their conversation in the living room. Nobody thanked her. Nobody offered to help. I remembered family dinners from years ago when Emily used to laugh the loudest. She had always been the heart of every gathering. Now she seemed almost invisible inside her own home. The next morning I woke early because my body was still adjusting to the time difference. The house was quiet. As I walked toward the kitchen, I noticed a light already on. Emily stood at the counter preparing breakfast. The clock on the microwave read 5:18 a.m. "You are up early," I said. She smiled faintly. "There is a lot to do." I opened the refrigerator and stopped. A weekly schedule was attached to the door with magnets. Names and responsibilities filled every day of the week. Laundry, grocery shopping, cleaning, yard appointments, doctor visits, bill reminders. Nearly every task had Emily's name beside it. I stared at the list. Emily noticed where I was looking and quickly closed the refrigerator door. Neither of us spoke. But in that silence, I became certain of one thing. Whatever story I had been told from thousands of miles away for 15 years was not the truth. And for the first time since returning home, I stopped asking myself whether something was wrong. I already knew it was. That afternoon, I decided to stop asking direct questions. Every time I asked Emily something important, the same thing happened. Her eyes shifted away. Her answers became shorter. The walls went up. Whatever had happened in this house had not happened overnight. It had been built slowly, one day at a time, over many years. People do not learn to stay silent in a single moment. They learn it after being ignored often enough. They learn it after being told their feelings do not matter. They learn it after giving up hope that anyone will listen. So I watched instead. The next few days revealed more than any conversation could have. Every morning, Emily woke before everyone else. By 6 o'clock, breakfast was already prepared. Coffee waited on the counter. Lunches were packed. Appointments were organized. Deliveries were scheduled. She seemed to carry the entire household on her shoulders. Yet when people discussed plans, nobody asked for her opinion. When decisions were made, her name was rarely mentioned. One afternoon, Vanessa invited several friends over for lunch. I sat quietly in the living room reading a book while they gathered around the dining table. The conversation drifted through the house. Most of it was harmless. Then I heard something that made me stop turning pages. "Emily is such a blessing," one woman said. "I do not know how you manage to keep everything running so smoothly." Vanessa laughed. "Honestly, she is just used to helping. She would not know what to do if she sat still." The group laughed politely. Through the doorway, I saw Emily carrying a tray of drinks into the room. She heard every word. Not once did she react. Not once did she look up. She simply placed the glasses on the table and left again. That silence disturbed me more than any argument could have. Later that evening, I found myself standing in front of the old hallway closet. For years, I had stored important documents there. Insurance papers, property records, tax files. The closet still existed, but everything inside had changed. New folders filled the shelves. Different labels. Different handwriting. I searched casually at first, not wanting to attract attention. Then I noticed something strange. Every document connected to the house had been moved into a locked filing cabinet inside Richard's home office. The cabinet sat in the corner beside his desk. A small key remained in the lock. I glanced toward the hallway. Nobody was nearby. For a few seconds, I simply stood there looking at it. Then I opened the drawer. Inside were dozens of folders. Utility bills, mortgage statements from other properties, insurance forms, business records. I carefully examined the labels. One folder immediately caught my attention. The address matched this house. My pulse quickened. I opened it. The first page appeared normal. The second page did not. I stared at the names listed on several forms. Richard Carter, Vanessa Carter. Again and again their names appeared. Ownership records, maintenance contracts, home improvement agreements. The deeper I looked, the more confused I became. I remembered every dollar I had spent purchasing this home. I remembered the closing documents. I remembered placing the property under Emily's protection before leaving the country. Yet almost every recent record suggested someone had been quietly rewriting the story. Suddenly, I heard footsteps approaching. I closed the folder and returned everything exactly as I had found it. A second later, Richard entered the office. "Everything okay, Mom?" he asked casually. I smiled, just looking around. "It has been a long time." He nodded and walked away without suspicion. But that night, I barely slept. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail in my mind. The room beside the laundry area, the weekly schedule, the missing photographs, the documents hidden away in a locked cabinet. Individually, they might have meant nothing. Together, they formed a picture I could no longer ignore. Someone had changed the rules of this family while I was gone. And for reasons I still did not understand, Emily had become the person paying the price. The following morning, I drove into town alone. I told everyone I wanted to visit a few old places and reconnect with memories. That part was true, but I also needed answers that were not filtered through polite smiles and careful conversations. The small title office that had handled the purchase of the house years ago was still there. The building looked older, but the receptionist recognized my name almost immediately after checking the records. "You bought that property a long time ago," she said warmly. "I remember seeing the file when we digitized our archives." I smiled and asked if certain public records could be reviewed. An hour later, I sat in a quiet room, studying documents that had not passed through Richard's office or Vanessa's filing cabinet. What I found did not immediately explain everything, but it confirmed one important fact. The original ownership structure was exactly as I remembered. The protections I had put in place for Emily had existed, at least in the beginning. As I left the office, more questions filled my mind than answers. Somewhere along the way, the story had changed. The problem was discovering when. On my way home, I stopped at a small diner that had been part of the neighborhood for decades. The booths were the same. The coffee tasted the same. Even the old clock above the counter seemed unchanged. I had barely taken a sip when a familiar voice called my name. "Helen? Is that really you?" I turned and immediately recognized Margaret Lawson. She had lived 2 houses down from us years ago. We spent many summer evenings talking over backyard fences while our children played together. We hugged and spent several minutes catching up. Eventually, the conversation shifted toward the family. "Emily has always been such a sweetheart," Margaret said. The smile on her face faded slightly. "She has been through a lot." I remained quiet. Margaret studied me carefully. "You do not know, do you?" The question sent a chill through me. "Know what?" For a few moments, she seemed uncertain whether she should continue. Then she sighed. "People in the neighborhood noticed changes years ago. At first, it was small things. Emily stopped attending community events. Then she stopped having friends over. Eventually, she hardly left the house except for errands." I listened without interrupting. "Everyone assumed she was helping family," Margaret continued. "But after a while, it started looking different. She was always the one cleaning, carrying things, running around for everyone else." My hands tightened around my coffee cup. "Did she ever say anything?" Margaret shook her head. "Never. If anyone asked, she defended Richard and Vanessa immediately. That sounded exactly like the Emily I knew. Loyal even when loyalty cost her something." Before leaving, Margaret touched my arm gently. "I always wondered why you never came home. Emily used to talk about you all the time." Then one day she stopped. The drive back felt longer than the drive into town. The pieces were beginning to connect. Not completely, but enough to reveal a pattern. Emily had not simply become quiet. She had gradually disappeared from her own life. That evening, I watched her more carefully than ever. She moved through the house efficiently, anticipating everyone's needs before they spoke. When Richard misplaced his keys, she found them. When Vanessa wanted a package mailed, Emily handled it. When a repair company called, Emily coordinated the appointment. She seemed responsible for everything. Yet ownership belonged to someone else. Recognition belonged to someone else. Authority belonged to someone else. Later that night, after everyone had gone upstairs, I found Emily sitting alone on the back porch. A small lamp illuminated her face. For once, she was not working. She was simply sitting in silence. I joined her without speaking. The summer air was warm. Crickets chirped beyond the fence line. Several minutes passed before she finally looked at me. "You have been asking questions," she said quietly. It was not an accusation. It was an observation. "Yes," I admitted. She stared into the darkness beyond the yard. "You should not worry about me." I felt my heart ache. Not because of the words themselves, but because of how familiar they sounded. They were the words of someone who had spent years carrying burdens alone. "Emily," I said softly, "a mother never stops worrying." Her eyes filled with emotion she could no longer completely hide. For the first time since my return, she looked as though she wanted to tell me something. And for the first time, I believed the truth was finally beginning to surface. Emily remained silent for so long that I wondered if she would stand up and leave. The porch light cast a soft glow across her face, highlighting the exhaustion she had tried so hard to hide since I arrived. Finally, she took a slow breath. "Do you remember what you told me before you left?" she asked. "You told me that no matter what happened, I would always have a place that belonged to me." I nodded. "I remember every word." She looked down at her hands. I held on to that for a long time. The sadness in her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of years. I waited. Sometimes people need silence more than questions. "After you left, things were normal at first," she said. "Richard visited often. He helped with repairs. He said he wanted to look after me while you were away." I listened carefully. Then Vanessa came into the picture. At first she was kind. Everyone liked her. I liked her too. Emily gave a faint smile that disappeared almost immediately. Little things started changing after they got married. Nothing dramatic. Just small things. Richard asked if they could stay temporarily while they saved for their own place. I said yes. It seemed reasonable. The story sounded painfully familiar. Major changes often begin with requests that appear harmless. Then they needed more space. Then they needed another room. Then they needed somewhere to store things. Every change sounded temporary. Emily stared into the darkness beyond the yard. Years passed. Somehow the temporary arrangements never ended. My chest tightened. "Why did you not tell me?" Emily laughed softly, though there was no joy in it. "Because every time we spoke, I told myself things would get better before your next call. I did not want you worrying about me thousands of miles away." I thought about all those video calls, all those conversations where she smiled and assured me everything was fine. How many times had she hidden the truth to protect me? And after a while, she continued, I was embarrassed. Those words hurt the most. Not because she had failed, but because someone had convinced her she should feel ashamed. "There is nothing for you to be embarrassed about," I said firmly. Emily did not answer. A few minutes later she stood up and quietly returned inside. But she had told me enough. The next morning I noticed another detail I had overlooked. A stack of mail sat on the kitchen counter waiting to be sorted. While organizing envelopes, Emily stepped away to answer the phone. Without thinking, I glanced at the return addresses. Several bills were addressed to Richard, others to Vanessa. Then I found one addressed to Emily. It was from a local credit union. The envelope looked worn, as though it had been moved around before finally reaching her. When Emily returned, she quickly slipped it into a drawer. The movement was subtle, too subtle for most people to notice. I noticed. Later that afternoon, while everyone else was occupied, I walked through the neighborhood alone. Familiar streets brought back memories. Children rode bicycles where my children once had. Trees we planted decades ago now stretched high above the sidewalks. As I passed one house, an elderly man watering flowers waved me over. His name was Walter. He had lived on the street even longer than we had. After exchanging greetings, he asked how long I planned to stay. "As long as necessary," I replied. Walter nodded slowly. "That is probably a good thing." Something in his tone made me pause. "Why do you say that?" He set down the garden hose and looked toward my house. "Because that girl of yours has carried that family for years. Everybody around here knows it." I felt my pulse quicken. Walter continued. "She pays attention to everyone, runs every errand, solves every problem. Yet somehow she is always treated like she is lucky just to be there." I thanked him and continued walking, but his words followed me all the way home. By the time I reached the driveway, one truth had become impossible to ignore. The people who knew Emily best were not describing a dependent family member. They were describing the person holding everything together. And somehow, despite all her sacrifices, she had ended up with the least power of anyone under that roof. The next few days changed something inside me. Until then, I had been gathering impressions, observations, and fragments of conversations. Now I wanted facts. Facts do not care about appearances. Facts do not care about carefully crafted family stories. They simply exist. One morning after Richard left for work and Vanessa went shopping, I drove to the county records office. I had no dramatic plan. I only wanted to understand how a house purchased for my daughter had somehow become a place where she lived like a guest. The clerk helping me was patient and professional. Public records are rarely exciting, but that day every page felt important. I reviewed property filings, tax records, and document histories connected to the address. The deeper I looked, the more complicated the picture became. Nothing suggested a straightforward transfer. Instead, I found years of amendments, authorizations, and administrative changes that seemed designed to gradually shift control away from Emily without attracting attention. None of it looked alarming when viewed individually. Together, however, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Someone had been moving pieces across a chessboard for years. When I returned home that afternoon, Emily was trimming hedges in the backyard. The Texas heat was intense, yet she continued working without complaint. I watched her through the kitchen window for several minutes. Richard and Vanessa were inside enjoying the air conditioning while Emily worked outdoors. The image stayed with me. Later that evening, I noticed another detail. Vanessa was hosting a dinner for several business associates. The dining room table was beautifully arranged. Fresh flowers sat in the center. Candles flickered softly. Everything looked elegant. As guests arrived, Vanessa greeted them warmly. Richard discussed investments and future plans. Emily moved quietly through the room, refilling glasses and serving food. Then one guest smiled at Emily and asked a simple question. "How long have you worked for the family?" For a moment, the room became perfectly still. The guest clearly assumed Emily was an employee. Emily froze. Richard looked uncomfortable. Vanessa laughed lightly. "Oh, Emily is family. She is just incredibly helpful." The conversation quickly moved on. Most people forgot the moment immediately. I did not. Neither did Emily. I saw the hurt in her eyes before she looked away. That night, long after everyone else had gone upstairs, I found her washing dishes alone. The dishwasher sat empty beside her. "Why are you doing that by hand?" I asked. She shrugged. "It is faster." I stood beside her in silence. Finally, I picked up a towel and began drying plates. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Emily surprised me. "I used to have plans, you know." Her voice was barely above a whisper. I turned toward her. "What kind of plans?" She smiled sadly. "I wanted to open a small bookstore. Nothing fancy, just a place where people could sit, drink coffee, and talk about books." I remembered those dreams. She used to talk about them constantly. "What happened?" I asked gently. Emily stared at the sink full of dishes. "Life happened. Somebody always needed something. There was always another responsibility, another problem to solve, another reason to wait." The answer broke my heart because it sounded so reasonable. Dreams rarely disappear all at once. They fade little by little while people convince themselves they will return to them later. Before going to bed that night, I sat alone in the guest room reviewing everything I had learned. The records, the neighbors, the conversations, the way Emily spoke about herself. For years, she had been carrying responsibilities that benefited everyone except her. And the most troubling realization of all was this. I no longer believed anyone in the house saw it. They had grown so accustomed to Emily giving everything that her sacrifices had become invisible. But I saw them. And for the first time since coming home, I felt something stronger than confusion. I felt certainty. The truth was no longer hiding from me. It was waiting for the right moment to be revealed. The following weekend, I made an announcement at breakfast. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would raise suspicion. I simply smiled and said that before returning to Canada to settle a few remaining matters, I wanted to host a family dinner. Richard seemed pleased. Vanessa immediately began discussing menus and decorations. Emily quietly offered to help prepare everything. "Not this time," I told her. "You have done enough." The surprise on her face lasted only a second, but I noticed it. Throughout the week, I continued gathering information. I reviewed copies of public records. I organized notes from conversations with neighbors. Most importantly, I paid attention to the people living under the same roof. Once I started looking carefully, patterns appeared everywhere. Richard and Vanessa relied on Emily for almost every aspect of daily life. Yet they spoke about her contributions as though they were favors she performed rather than responsibilities she carried. By Friday evening, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. The dinner itself was beautiful. The dining room glowed under soft lighting. The table was set with the good dishes I remembered from years ago. Richard arrived in a cheerful mood. Vanessa looked elegant and confident. Emily helped bring out the food despite my objections. Old habits are difficult to break. For the first half hour, conversation remained pleasant. We talked about weather, work, travel, and neighborhood changes. Then I placed my fork down and looked around the table. "There is something I have been thinking about since I came home," I said calmly. The room grew quiet. Richard smiled uncertainly. "What is that, Mom?" I folded my hands in front of me. "I have been trying to understand how this household functions." Vanessa laughed lightly. "It functions pretty well, I think." "It certainly does," I replied. "In fact, it functions so well that I started wondering who makes that possible." Emily immediately lowered her eyes. Richard shifted slightly in his chair. I continued. "Every morning breakfast appears. Every appointment gets scheduled. Every problem gets solved. Every errand gets completed. Every detail is handled. Nobody interrupted. The interesting thing is that the person doing all those things never seems to receive any credit." The silence deepened. Vanessa's smile began to fade. Richard looked toward Emily and then quickly away again. "Mom," he said carefully, "I am not sure what you mean." I met his gaze. "I think you know exactly what I mean." For the first time since arriving, I watched genuine discomfort spread across his face. Not anger, not defensiveness, something closer to realization. "I spent years believing Emily was living the life we planned for her," I continued. "Instead, I found a woman carrying the weight of an entire household while slowly disappearing from the center of her own story." Emily stared at the table. Her eyes filled with tears she was trying hard to contain. Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. The confidence she normally carried seemed less certain now. "I spoke with neighbors," I said softly. "I reviewed records. I listened. And what I learned surprised me." Richard leaned forward. "What did you learn?" I looked directly at him. "I learned that the strongest person in this family is the one everyone takes for granted." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Across the table, Emily slowly lifted her head. For the first time since my return, she was not looking at the floor. She was looking straight ahead. And in that moment, I realized something important. The truth did not always arrive with shouting or confrontation. Sometimes it entered a room quietly and simply refused to leave. Nobody rushed to defend themselves after that dinner. That was what surprised me most. People often imagine that the truth creates immediate arguments. In reality, the truth can leave a room so quiet that everyone is forced to hear their own thoughts. Richard sat staring at his plate long after the meal ended. Vanessa remained unusually silent. Emily looked overwhelmed by the attention she had spent years avoiding. The next morning, I found Richard sitting alone at the kitchen table. A cup of coffee sat untouched in front of him. He looked tired, older somehow. When he saw me, he managed a weak smile. "Mom, can we talk?" I sat down across from him. For several seconds, he struggled to find the right words. Finally, he sighed. I think I stopped paying attention. The honesty caught me off guard. He rubbed his forehead and stared down at the table. Everything happened gradually. Vanessa and I became busy. Emily always stepped in to help. Whenever there was a problem, she handled it. Whenever something needed to be done, she volunteered. After a while, I stopped noticing how much she was carrying. I listened quietly. "That is not an excuse," he continued. "It is just the truth." For the first time since my return, I saw genuine regret in my son's eyes. Later that afternoon, something unexpected happened. Emily left the house. Not to run errands. Not to buy groceries. Not to handle someone else's responsibilities. She simply left to spend the day by herself. When she returned several hours later, she looked different. Not dramatically different. Just lighter. As though a small weight had finally been removed from her shoulders. A few days later, I invited her to lunch. We sat inside a small bookstore and cafe on the edge of town. Shelves lined the walls. The smell of coffee filled the air. Emily smiled as she looked around. "This place is beautiful," she said. I smiled back. "It reminds me of something." She laughed softly. "My old dream." "Your dream does not have to stay old," I replied. The look on her face told me she had not allowed herself to consider that possibility in years. We spent the afternoon talking about books, business ideas, and plans for the future. Not responsibilities. Not obligations. Not everyone else's needs. Her future. For the first time in a very long time. Over the following weeks, changes continued. Small changes at first. Richard began handling more of his own responsibilities. Vanessa became noticeably quieter whenever Emily was automatically expected to solve a problem. The household slowly adjusted to a reality it should have recognized years earlier. Most importantly, Emily began setting boundaries. The first time she said, "I cannot do that today," the world did not end. Nobody fell apart. Life continued. Sometimes the hardest lesson is discovering that you are allowed to put yourself on your own priority list. Before returning to Canada, I stood with Emily on the front porch where we had once taken that photograph 15 years earlier. The evening sun painted the neighborhood in shades of gold. We looked older now. Wiser perhaps. Certainly stronger. "I am sorry I was not here," I told her quietly. Emily shook her head. "You came back." Simple words. Powerful words. Because in the end, the greatest gift I could give my daughter was never the house. Houses are wood, brick, and concrete. They can be occupied, renovated, and argued over. What truly mattered was helping her remember her own worth. No document could provide that. No property record could guarantee it. As I prepared to leave, I looked at the home one final time. The walls had not changed. The address had not changed. But something inside had. Emily was no longer living on the edges of her own life. She was stepping back into the center of it. And as I watched her stand a little taller than before, I realized that was the homecoming I had truly been searching for all along.